I'm Valerie Pringle, and The Golden Spruce by John Vaillant is one of my favorite books. It is a great Canadian book. It's a non-fiction book about something that happened in 1997 in, I guess, what most people know as the Queen Charlotte Islands, the islands off the coast of BC, Haida Gwaii. Haida Gwaii is the homeland of the Haida people who live there. And on those islands grew this magnificent tree, 300 years old, that was unique. It was gold instead of green, and it was known as the Golden Spruce, sacred to the Haida people. And it was chopped down by a logger named Grant Hadwin, who was protesting against clear cutting and the logging industry, which he'd been part of for years. But this story sort of weaves together Hadwin and the Golden Spruce itself and how it came to be, legends of Haida Gwaii and the Haida people, the history of logging in British Columbia, throws in a little bit of botany, archaeology, wonderful history, and so many stories I never knew. I remember covering the story when the Golden Spruce fell because it was such a shocking event, and for a while, for a short while, people didn't know who'd done it, and then the mystery was solved. And then there continues to be a mystery about Grant Hadwin, which, is another one of the really interesting parts of this book. I just think it's so fascinating in so many ways that it's just perfect and beautifully written. The story begins with a mystery, and ultimately that mystery is never solved. But this is some of what the prologue says. Small things are hard to find in Alaska, so when a marine biologist named Scott Walker stumbled across a wrecked kayak on an uninhabited island 50 kilometers north of the Canadian border, he considered himself lucky. The coastal boundary where Alaska and British Columbia meet and overlap is a jagged four-way seam that joins not just a pair of vast and vastly different countries, but two equally large and divergent wildernesses. To the west is the gaping expanse of the North Pacific Ocean, and to the east is the infinity of mountains that forms the heart of what some in the Northwest call Cascadia. The coastline where these worlds meet and bleed into one another is sparsely inhabited and often obscured by fog, the mountains sheared off by low-lying clouds. The combination of high winds, frequent fog, and tidal surges that can run over 15 knots makes this coast a particularly lethal one. And when boats or planes or people go missing here, they're usually gone for good. If they're found, it's often by accident. So Walker finds this kayak, and then there's more, strewn further down the tide line, personal effects, a raincoat, a backpack, an axe. These things can't just have washed off a boat. The sleeping bag in near perfect condition, so he's wondering what happens and goes to the police and finds out through the Alaska State Troopers in Ketchikan, 50 kilometers to the north, that the kayak and its owner, a Canadian timber surveyor and expert woodsman named Grant Hadwin, had been missing, not for weeks, but for months. This man, it seemed, was on the run, wanted for a strange and unprecedented crime. Well, we never do find out what happened to Hadwin beyond that, but the rest is his story, and then the speculation as to where he might be. Presumed dead, but not certain.
Every story has a spine, and the spine of this story is clearly that of Grant Hadwin and how he came to cut down the tree and what happened after that. But for us to understand the significance of it, there's so much that we need to know. And so I felt that the author actually structured this like a tree, so that we have the foundation of the geography, the place setting. We go up the spine, we learn a little bit about Grant Hadwin, and then we come out, we learn all about logging, and we come up and we learn all about the Haida, everything that we need to know to put in context the action of what Grant Hadwin did.
It rains a lot in Haida Gwaii. It's a rainforest, and so I think that's why the Golden Spruce was also so wonderful. They said it always looked like it had sunshine on it. As you can see, an extraordinary tree, and this is just a little bit of background about it. During one autumn around 1700 on the west bank of the Yukon River, a random Sitka spruce cone opened and let a seed like no other drift to earth. It was one among hundreds of seeds that fell that year from one among thousands of cones produced by one among tens of millions of Sitka spruce trees growing on the northwest coast. Its parent tree may well have been scattering seeds since the time of the Vikings. Were it not for the fact that an individual spruce seed's chances of survival are comparable to those of a human sperm, every parent tree would be a forest unto itself. As it is, despite as many as 750 years of fertility, a typical Sitka spruce may produce only a dozen offspring that survive to maturity. That the seed in question would be one of them mystifies people to this day. Unless a tree is particularly large or unusually shaped, it will not stand out as an individual. And unless it is isolated from its mates, it will seldom announce itself from a distance. But despite being embedded in a forest of similarly large trees, the tree that came to be known as the Golden Spruce was an exception on both counts. From the ground, its startling color stopped people dead in their tracks. From the air, it looked out like a beacon and was visible from miles away. Like much of the surrounding landscape, the tree was incorporated into the Haida's vast repertoire of stories. But as far as anyone knows, it is the only tree in what was then an infinity of trees ever to be given a name by the Haida people. They called it Kid Kias, Elder Spruce Tree. According to legend, it was a human being who had been transformed. Although it was well known to those who lived around the Yukon Valley, the golden spruce wasn't discovered by scientists until well into the 20th century. By then, it was more than 200 years old and all but impossible to miss. When the Scottish timber surveyor and baronet, Sir Wyndham Anstruther, stumbled across the tree in 1924, he was dumbfounded. "I didn't even make an axe mark on it," he told one reporter before he died, being, I suppose, a bit overcome by its strangeness in a forest of green. For years afterward, no one knew quite what to make of Sir Wyndham's arboreal unicorn. Some suggested it might be a new species native to the archipelago. Others supposed the tree had been hit by lightning or was simply in the process of dying. As it turned out, the tree was alive and well. It was just fantastically rare. So rare, in fact, that it warranted its own scientific name, Pichia sincensis aurea. Pichia sincensis being the Latin name for the Sitka spruce, and aurea is Latin for golden or gleaming like gold, but it can also mean beautiful or splendid. It was 16 stories tall and more than 6 meters around. The golden spruce was unique in the botanical world. Grant Hadwin grew up in Vancouver. His dad was a professional. He had a good education, but his uncle was a logger, and that's the business he went into. And he was very, very good at it. But this book gives a wonderful insight into logging and what's involved in bringing down some of those enormous trees on the West Coast. And I'll read in part what's involved. After determining the optimal falling direction, usually a three-way compromise between personal preference, the tree's natural lean, and the lay of the land, a wedge is cut facing in the desired direction of the fall. If a saw is available, a horizontal undercut is made about 1/3 of the way into the trunk, a serious undertaking in the case of a big West Coast tree. Prior to the chainsaw, this would have been accomplished in stages. A cut could be made, and then the wood above would be chopped out with an axe to make more room and reduce the friction imposed on the saw blade. Then another cut would be made, followed by more chopping, and in this way the fallers would cut and hack their way into the tree. Many early photos show a whiskey bottle hanging from a tree within an arm's reach of the fallers. These bottles were filled not with whiskey to lubricate the men, but with oil to lubricate the saws as they worked their way into the wet, often sappy trunks. Gibson's crosscut saws, broad ribbons of toothed steel with broom-style handles at each end, were 2 and 3 meters long, and his double-bitted axes were more than 30 centimeters wide from blade edge to blade edge. With 2 men working steadily, perched on opposing springboards, Gibson's 4-meter, 800-year-old Doug fir would have taken all day to bring down. At dusk, when the heartworm finally gave way with a sternum-shuddering groan, the men dropped their tools, jumped from their perches, and fled uphill into the thick salal that covered the steeply angled forest floor. From there they watched as the fruit of their labors, weighing as much as a jumbo jet, came crashing down to earth. It is such a dangerous profession, was an even more dangerous profession. And he adds, West Coast logging, especially in its early 20th century heyday, was not so much tree cutting as it was a kind of terrestrial whaling. Determined, poorly paid men working in remote areas were using temperamental machinery and simple hand tools to subdue enormous, often unpredictable creatures that could squash them like bugs, and did. One county on the Washington coast lost more than 100 men to logging accidents in a single year, and there are still lots of ways to die.
The loggers portrayed in the book are heroes. They undergo all sorts of horrible hardships. It's fascinating, riveting reading. And these are the guys who are cutting down all the old trees. So the sort of knee-jerk liberal city boy in me says, wait, are these the bad guys or the good guys? Because it's really kind of cool to find out how they live their life, and they're admirable people. And yet here they are doing this stuff that I've been brought up to not like. And do Vaillant credit, he doesn't take an easy route and make you know, the odd guy the bad guy. These are strong characters, and they're both positive and negative.
Sometimes when you're reading a book, you come across statements that seem to encapsulate the whole book. Well, there was one point where John Vaillant writes, very few people have actually seen a logging operation who are not part of that operation. And when I read that, I thought, this is actually like a seed, a germ of what this book is all about. It's mysteries, it's codes. It's about shedding light on things that are really all around us, but we don't see it.
So here we have Hadwin, who turns from a logger to someone who is protesting against what logging is doing and decides the Golden Spruce will be his way of staging the protest. Kayaks across in winter from Prince Rupert to Haida Gwaii, swims the Yukon River at night with his chainsaw on his back, and here is how Vaillant tells this. As Hadwin was making his cuts, he was, like every logger, also carving his way into the past. Tree rings that had been hidden since Harry Tingley picnicked there with his father, since the last smallpox epidemic emptied the surrounding villages, since Captain Kendrick was riddled with grape shot, since a time before Captain Perez and Chief Koya were born. All this fled by unnoticed in a flickering comet's tail of sawdust. Hadwin didn't stop cutting until about 1710, when his own ancestors were still living a near tribal existence in the British Isles, and the masts of the first Nor'westmen had yet to puncture the southern horizon. Then Hadwin shut down the saw, packed up his gear, and floated it back across the Yukon, leaving behind an audible silence and a tree so unstable that it would have shivered with every breath. Hadwin then sent letters to the media and a few other organizations claiming credit for what he'd done to the pet plant. Very strange communique. And then the story goes on. A day later, the Golden Spruce came crashing down. Locally, the reaction was overwhelming, particularly within the Haida community. It was like a drive-by shooting in a small town. John Broadhead, a longtime resident of the islands, explained. People were crying. They were in shock. They felt enormous guilt for not protecting the tree better. Broadhead paused for a moment, trying to express the true impact in a language someone who wasn't Haida would understand. It was as if someone had done a drive-by on the Little Prince, he said at last. According to Haida legend, the Golden Spruce represented a good but defiant young boy who had been transformed. And because of this, some among the Haida saw the crime not as an act of vandalism or protest, but as a kind of murder.
Considering that it's a work of nonfiction, I really like that The Golden Spruce reads like a ripping yarn, an adventure story. You're caught up, or I was very much caught up in the character of the protagonist. And at the end, you're left hanging. Does he make it or not? And the part of you that roots for him, because while he's a troubled guy, he's still our guy, the part of you that roots for him wants him to survive the raging waters. It's effective storytelling, it's effective literature, in addition to being a good or accurate portrait of the events.
For all his cunning and planning, Grant Hadwin was really still quite naive and kind of innocent. He had no clue that the Haida revered this tree the way they did. He didn't know the legends. It's incredible to think that he did something with just, half knowing the story, and in the end, the repercussions were so much greater than he ever could have imagined.
The falling of the Golden Spruce was a big news story. People from all around the world were interested in this. I mean, they all understood the concept of this rare, beautiful tree, a tree of life. I remember interviewing Gujaw for Canada AM as they tried to sort out who had done this and found out about Grant Hadwin and continued on. But this is how the aftermath goes in the book. When the Golden Spruce fell, it knocked down every tree in its path. From a distance, it looked like the wreckage left by a lightning strike or a freak wind, which in a way it was. After all, what were the chances? The Golden Spruce was 1 in a billion, and so was Grant Hadwin. Whoever did this, said a Macmillan Bloedel spokesman shortly after the tree was found, had to be hell-bent. He was referring not just to the logistical details, to the raw effort required to access the tree and then cut it down in the middle of the night. It's hard to imagine anyone else with the same combination of motive, obsession, endurance, and skill required to do such a thing. And after it fell, on the following Saturday, February 1st, a public memorial service to mourn one of our ancestors was held on the riverbank opposite the fallen tree. It was Ernie Big Eagle Collison, known as Skile the Steersman, who organized and presided over much of the ceremony. With him were numerous Haida chiefs and other leaders, including Gujaw, whose name means drum. At various times during the ceremony, the sound of drums grew so thunderous in the crepuscular silence of the forest that the beat seemed almost three-dimensional as they ricocheted off the tree trunks. Meanwhile, the singers' voices, Gujaw's in particular, echoed through the woods as they belted out Haida songs of mourning and renewal. These were sounds that had not been heard on the banks of the Yukon in ages, not since the Great Sickness and the roar of chainsaws that followed had drowned them out. The Haida are a really interesting tribe. I mean, they were very rich, big, strong people who lived in paradise so that they could create wonderful works of art and poles because food was abundant. And then as the English arrived, I mean, the boat they arrived in was called Queen Charlotte, which is why the islands were called that. It really does seem like a bit of an abomination. And then wiped them out with smallpox and clear cutting and lots of other poxes. But I guess the really happy story is that there's a great resurgence in their culture, in claiming the wonderful art that they do and in the world that is theirs. And so that's why it seems so important to me, really, to call the islands Haida Gwaii. It's what they are. It's their land.
Nature as a force is both a really good plot developer and a fine background for a story. And in The Golden Spruce, Vaillant does a great job of portraying the strength, the power of nature.
Was Grant Hadwin crazy? I mean, there are Many explorations of his mental state, why he did what he did, how he got that way, and then his final decision, which was to kayak across the Hecate Strait from Prince Rupert over to Haida Gwaii to face his court date and be charged with the offense. In February, people thought that was completely insane, and that's when he vanished. I mean, the mystery has continued since that day. He's never been found. But Vaillant has this spectacular description about the body of water that lies between the mainland and Haida Gwaii, Hecate Strait. The strait is a malevolent weather factory. On a regular basis, its unique combination of wind, tide, shoals, and shallows produces a kind of destructive synergy that has few parallels elsewhere in nature. From the northeast come katabatic winds generated by cold air rushing down from the mountains and funneling wind tunnel style through the region's many fjords, the largest of these being Portland Inlet, which empties into the strait 50 kilometers north of Prince Rupert. Winter storms, meanwhile, are generally driven by Arctic low-pressure systems borne over Alaska, and they tend to manifest themselves as southerlies along the coast. It is because of these winds that the weather buoy at the south end of Hecate Strait has registered waves over 30 meters high. One of the things that makes the strait so dangerous is that these two opposing weather systems can occur simultaneously.
I learned so much as I was reading this book. And I felt that the things that I learned are so much a part of the fabric of being a Canadian that I should have known them. So I actually felt a sense of gratitude when I'd finished it, that my mind had been opened up, and all these things that perhaps I had skimmed headlines of now really came to life for me.
I recommend this book to people all the time. And I find many people have never heard of it, even though it won lots of awards, but it tells so much about our country and a part of our country. You know, I guess a lot of people don't know about that wild West Coast, and particularly Haida Gwaii and the people who live there. And it peels away so many layers and adds so much to our knowledge, and it has rich power. And maybe, you know, is there a parable in this Golden Spruce? Is that tree the most important thing? Actually, there are little bits of it that people are cultivating. There may even be yet another Golden Spruce in the world. So that's just one of the mysteries that you can find out about.